In this video, I'm going to talk about how to remove the rear casing from the back of the transmission. The first thing we need to do is remove these big black plugs. And what these are, they're like a big piece of metal with all this rubber over the top of them. Getting these out is pretty difficult. And I worked out a way that seemed to be pretty effective so you could easily use the things again. The way these work, and there's one with this thing plugged in it, but these things slide in the back and plug in place, so it looks like that. And before you pull them off, mark them because they are different. They look the same, but they are subtly different. And then they sit inside there like that. So when you install, you push that in there, and they seal in there pretty hard, and then they just get plugged into place, and you just whack those around the edge. But to get these out, I've seen different things online, but this is the way that I found was most effective, because I tried, initially I drilled a hole in there to lever it out, which got it out. Initially I broke a screwdriver tip off, trying to lever these things out. They're in there really solidly. But this is the one that worked really well. And all I did was I get a Dremel tool with a really fine cutting blade and just put a little tiny cut in there. And then what I did was I then got a large screwdriver and levered it under there and just went pop and just popped that straight off. And that worked out really nicely. The plug was still there in place. This thing got a little bit bent, but then I was able to just get a hammer and a couple of sockets and just whack that into place. And with this plug jammed in there, a little bit of RTV sealant here, a little bit on the other side. This is really well sealed. So I don't think there's ever going to be any leaks. Like, this is perfectly dry anyhow after I took it off, so I don't think there's much oil going inside here. And then to install that with that thing in place like that, so looking like that, and all this stuff sealed up, all I would do is I'm just going to put that there like that. I would just put a little bit of RTV sealant around the outside there, and then just tap that into place, wipe off the excess, and I think that should be pretty well sealed. Once we get those caps off, other things that we'll need to do before we pull it off. You've got the oil temperature sensor which is going to sit in there. The temperature sensor can just stay in place, but you'll just need to electrically disconnect that. You'll need to remove the oil cooler here because you won't get access to these screws here otherwise. You'll need to remove all of these screws around here. They're all M8. And they take 6 Newton meters, these aluminium ones. I personally would be replacing those with steel. That's just me. And you also need to remove this one on this side. There's an equivalent one on the other side. Don't remove that. It's this one here because the reverse idler sprocket sits on a shaft which is held by these. And obviously we need to remove this one here so this cover can come off. And finally, you'll need to remove the 2 circlips that sit on the top of the shafts there. The screws that go around the edge here, M8, they're all 50 millimeters long, and there's 16 of those. And the one that came out of there is 60 millimeters long, and it has this sealing washer. So if you are replacing that screw, make sure you grab hold of that washer and fit it onto the screw that you're using. Once you get all those screws removed, now we need to pull the 2 shafts out of the interference fit that's on these 2 bearings. So you'll need to have some sort of a tool. I'll show you what I made up, which worked reasonably well. So this is the tool that I have made to remove the rear cover. So these holes in here are M10. So I've used pieces of M10 threaded bar. There are 4 of those. I've got a piece of 10mm plate steel. I've got a couple of angle pieces in there just to make it a bit stronger because I didn't know how much force was going to be involved. I'm not sure if I really needed that. And I've got pieces of M12 threaded bar inside here. They press on with nuts with these washers that are just smaller than the ends of the shafts. There's nuts top and bottom there to hold those in place at the correct length. And the way I'm going to do this is most of the time people try and push on this, but because it's just sitting on these washers, it's going to be a little bit hard to do that. So exactly the same effect is shortening these. That has the exact effect of lengthening this one here. So what I've done is set this up in exactly the right position so these are all the correct length, and now I'm going to tighten down on these, and that will shorten this relative to that, which will push the shafts out. On the ends of the threaded rod, I've just ground off some square edges So I can put an 8mm spanner on this, so I can turn this in and turn it out. And once we get the cover off, things that you'll see, that's where that screw went in for the shaft for the idler gear, which is that one there, for reverse. There's a bearing there on the output shaft. If bearing bits fall out like that, just grab hold of those. You've got the speed sensor there, you've got the distance sensor there. The harness for that just runs around the outside to the plug, which you can't see, it's just on the other side here, and it's exactly the same as the other one. You've got a big gasket which is metal, so that's the sort of thing that normally you would replace, because when they get compressed, the ridge in that goes away. However, without access to spares of that, I think it would be pretty easy just to put some RTV sealant on there. When you're fitting this, put this down, put some RTV sealant on the other side, and then just put that into place, and that should be perfectly okay, I would reckon. You have the tube here which goes to the oil pump. There's just a draw tube from the bottom down here, and that's the input to the oil pump at the back. That can just get pulled straight out like that. That just sits in the little hole down the bottom there. You have the big magnet that sits in that slot down there, so that'll just come straight out. You can clean that up prior to install. And to remove the harness, including the distance sensor and the speed sensor, there are 2 medium-sized screws that go into the speed sensor. There are 3 longer screws that hold in the distance sensor, and there are 2 shorter ones that hold onto the harness itself. Then we can just sort of move the harness around, because it's sort of going to be stuck under that lug there. We need to pull the plug out a little bit first, then twist it around so it'll come free. That'll come up, and now everything come out. There's your speed sensor there with the 2 speeds that it detects, and there's your distance sensor there. The way the distance sensor works, you can see there's 3 of the shift rods that you can see here. There's another one on the inside here, and the sensors run up and down in here, and on these black things on the other side, there's a big magnet, and it runs up and down. So that's the central position there when no gear is engaged, and it'll move either a centimetre up or down or so, and that's obviously what's being detected by the distance sensor. If you are removing screws with the gearbox in this orientation, be really careful you don't drop things. I would loosen the screws so they can come out, and then just grab it with a magnetic tool and pull those out, because if you drop it down in here, clearly that's going to be a bit special. On the inside of the rear cover, we've got the park lock here, and the shaft which comes from the other side here. When that's rotated, that pushes forward a little spring-loaded sort of lug here, which pushes this up, which will engage the park lock, which is on the output shaft. The bearing for that sat in there, and when you disengage park, that thing comes down a little bit. If you wanted to replace the seal on this shaft, you can pull it up from the outside, but the easiest way, there's a little pin there, and this is pretty typical of any ZF gearbox. You just knock that pin out, the pin will just slide straight out, then you have really access to the seal, so you can replace the seal, put the shaft back in, and plonk that pin back in again. Other things, you've got bushes here for the shift rods, for those 2 longer shift rods, and you've got the big bearings at the back. They have a T30 countersunk screw in those, and so if you want to remove those, they're an interference fit into the casing, so you'll need to remove those screws and then whack those out, and then obviously press some new bearings back in there. I'll put some details up of what the bearings are and what I've found out from bearing places about whether or not they are replaceable or not, if you can actually get hold of them. The big problem is getting these things out, these T30 screws. The T30 bit that goes in there is not very deep and they're easy to damage as you're removing those. So make sure you have this in a vise or something so it's really steady with a long bit and a really good quality T30 that's going to get all the way down in there, and then take it really easy as you are releasing it. Otherwise it's going to be easy to damage the T30 part of the bolt. They also have Loctite on them, so obviously they don't come out. So on install, I would be Loctiting those as well. They are M6 from memory, so I would use 10 Newton meters on those. And there are the screws and those covers removed from the bearings at the back, and now you can just tap those out. So these bearings, the designation on these, TM207U40AL and TM208U40AL. Something to be aware of when you have removed the rear cover. The way this is all held together, this the input shaft here, there's this big sort of washer on the end here that's pressed onto the shaft, so that can't move. But on this side here, there are a couple of washers that just come straight off, and then this gear can just come straight off, and then there's a sleeve, and then things can start to move. It's a bit hard for me to get my fingers in here, but you can see that start to move. In addition, when that one starts to move, this one also underneath it will start to move. Let's see if I can move that up. There we go. What you need to be aware of is if, for example, I needed to flip this upside down because I was removing the gear set or I was doing work at the other end of the transmission, if I don't secure these gears, these will automatically just want to flop down. The problem with that is in here is all the synchro mesh. That's triple synchro mesh where there's multiple pins of everything that's sort of joined together in there, and if this, it only needs to move a couple of millimeters away from it, and then things start to turn and all this synchro mesh will get out of sync, or it'll get out of alignment. And once it's like that, getting it back in there, if you don't really know what's going on here, is a complete nightmare. You might even end up having to just remove the gear set and completely disassemble all this end of it to try and sort everything out. So in order to stop that happening, what I would do is I'd put that on there. I'd immediately just remove those gears from the top here if I was going to flip it over, put that sleeve in place. I'm just going to put a hose clamp over the top of that, lock that in place so this cannot move, and now I can flip it upside down and none of this is going to fall apart. Also, something to be aware of if you've got the cover off, and the temptation, like I had, was to start moving these shifters back and forth just to see how everything works. My suggestion is not to do that because you can get some of the synchro mesh pieces, because there's lots of little pieces. The struts in here have little balls and springs and stuff, and things can just start to pop out, and again you might end up having to disassemble the gear set to try and sort it all out. So my advice would be not to start playing with things. And depending on what you've removed when you removed the rear cover, make sure all this goes back on before you put the cover back on. The baffle, the oil lubrication pipe here, both the sensors and the electrics, that's all connected. The magnet in there, the uptake pipe for the oil pump, the bearing needs to be sitting on there, then the gasket, and then the cover can go in place. Also, prior to putting on the rear casing, make sure the park lever is out of park, otherwise it'll try and press down on one of these things. It needs to be clear of that as you install it. And as you're putting on the cover, look down through the holes here to check that everything aligns correctly. You're going to put it over the dowel here and give it a bit of a gentle wiggle so everything should just slot down nicely into place. And you'll know it just is obvious when it just slots down really solidly. It's on the dowel here. The gasket's in place. And it's nicely gone into probably a mil or so into the bearings. So the way I'm going to draw the shafts up into the bearing, I'm not going to screw down here because I don't want to push down on the outside of the bearing, and that's going to put pressure on the inside of the transmission as well. what I'm going to do is draw the shafts up into the bearing. The way I'm going to do that is by a big bolt. There's a thread on each side, on the inside of each of these. The big one, 24 by 1.5 millimeter thread pitch. This one's M22 by 1.5 millimeter. With some big bolts, another nut, bunch of washers, lots of grease in between, and a tool. This is from a bushing removal tool, which is just slightly larger than the shaft, and it's going to sit around the edge of the inner race of the bearing. The larger shaft, 40 millimeters. This one is 33, so this one's going to use a 42 millimeter tool. I'm going to use a 34 millimeter tool on this one here. And all I'm going to do is screw that all the way home. So that's all the way in there. Align that and then screw that down. I'm going to hold that and turn that one, and that's going to draw it up into it. There's a couple of millimeters of slack on the inside for each of the shafts, so you don't have to move them up perfectly evenly, so you can sort of go up and down a little bit, maybe bring it up a millimeter each side at a time. This one here is at the bottom of the threads. It goes down about 1.5 centimeters or so. This one's pretty easy to remove because it'll be down there. You just get a screwdriver and just whack it with a mallet and it'll go pop like that, and then you can just grab it and pull it out. This one here looks like it would be easy, and it's sitting at the top of the thread, like way up the top here, and I think that's so maybe when they're lifting in the factory they grab hold of this one rather than this one here as they're lifting the thing around. I don't know, because they don't really serve any other purpose. But you would think you just get your circlip pliers onto that, compress that, and it comes straight out. No, unfortunately not. That doesn't compress it enough. So you'll need to get in there and then just lever that out. That actually took a fair bit of time to get that thing out. But once you do that, then you have access to these two holes. Unfortunately for this one here, this bolt I can only get 100 millimeters long. This one's 120, which seems to be the ideal length for this length of this bit in here. So I'm having to use a shorter one here, draw it up a bit, and then I'm going to go ahead and put this one inside. Because this is too small, I'm not going to be able to pull the shaft up inside, and when it's that last bit of movement, I'll pull up this one. And when you're pulling this up, I'm probably going to do a full turn each at a time. It should come up relatively easily. If there's any real hindrance to the movement, make sure you stop, pull it off, and find out what's going on the inside, that something's not aligned correctly or something's gone wrong. And prior to install on the insides of the bearing and also on the shaft, I just put a light layer of grease, and it should draw up quite easily. One time when I pulled the shaft all the way through and I was trying to release this one, all it did was grip with the washers through this and turn the shaft. In that case, all I did was just get a big Stilson wrench on that and then just turn that and release it straight away. But if everything's greased up nicely, everything should just come off nicely once everything's home. And then you should be able to put those circlips on and they should click into place. If that doesn't happen, like they're sitting a little bit proud, what I found works, because they're a pretty tight fit, is to put the tools back on with the circlip on there, but sort of sitting above it. Push it down as far as you can with a screwdriver, and then put the tool over the top and squeeze exactly what we did before, and it'll just click into place. And once you're happy that everything's in the right position, you can put the caps on at the back. All the screws here around here can be reinstalled. The one here needs to be put in, and then the pump, etc., can go back on.